Black Dahlia. Episode 10. Mark Hansen. Mark Marinus Hansen, a Danish immigrant who arrived penniless in New York aboard the Lusitania in 1910. 5 years before the massive ship was sunk by a German U-boat that put it down with one torpedo, just as his obsession with Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, almost torpedoed him. What should have been an American success story come true brought him into the nightmare that would become Elizabeth Short's life and death. But was the self-made millionaire her murderer, an accomplice to her murderer, or just some sap who became attracted to a pretty girl at the wrong time and place? Let's start at the beginning. Born on July 25, 1891 in Aalborg, Denmark to mother, Maren Katrine, and father, Soren Christian Hansen, Mark would by his teenage years set his sights on a future in the New World. At 18, he crossed the Atlantic and made his way to Scobie, Montana, but work as a saloon keeper would never get the ambitious Hansen where he wanted to go in life. So he headed to Williston, North Dakota, where he got into the business that would help send him to Hollywood, the motion picture industry, but he wouldn't be making movies, he'd be showing them in a theater. In the early 1920s, he moved again, this time to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he would manage a bigger, better theater. Soon, with more experience, and the money to move to a warmer climate, he headed to Oxnard, California. In Oxnard, he bought a dilapidated opera house from Guy Douthwaite. Hansen intended to reopen it as a vaudeville theater, but the old building was a constant target of arsonists. And in 1922, a fire caused significant damage, even destroying $6,000 worth of equipment Hansen had bought and paid for out of his own pocket. He was undeterred by this setback, although his unsuccessful attempt to get the Oxnard Chamber of Commerce interested in building a movie studio near Oxnard to capitalize on the nearby scenic sand dunes did cause him some regret. He lamented not starting his own movie studio. He said,
"I worked my head off trying to get local men interested in building a studio either in Oxnard or toward the sand dunes. I think we made a mistake not going after this business a little stronger than we did."
Throwing in the towel with his movie-making dreams, he went back to what had gotten him this far. He bought 2 more theaters in Oxnard, the Lyric and the New Victory. By 1923, he expanded his business into Hollywood, investing $60,000 in buying the 100-seat Larchmont Theater, and soon adding the New Western, the Burbank, the Fox Arroyo, and the Knoll to his growing empire. Flowing on his growing wave of success in not just showing movies but also promoting them, he broke directly into the glamour of Hollywood by teaming up with silent screen star, Alice Calhoun. In 1926, they opened the Markle, the name being derived from Mar, for Mark, and Cal, for Calhoun. The 1,500-seat theater had been designed by local architect, William Allen, who incorporated 2 sections of the mezzanine completely enclosed in glass for separate party room and smoking room. Soon, the Markle would be prepared for the coming of the talkies, by making it the first theater to equip the Qualitone sound system. Also, in West Hollywood, he opened the 1,800-seat Marquee Theater, which had a $30,000 organ to accompany the silent films. Owning or operating 21 theaters throughout the Los Angeles area, he created Hansen Theaters Incorporated, which he sold to Paramount Theaters in 1926. The theater chain immediately placed him on their board of directors. But Hansen not only had a growing business empire, he had a family that had grown along with it. A wife, Ida, he had married in 1915. By the heyday of his success in the mid-20s, they had had 2 daughters. The family lived in the Hancock Park section of Los Angeles. All seemed well in Mark Hansen's world, both in business and family life, but the Great Depression was looming on the horizon. Soon, hard times would force Hansen to diversify into real estate, buying apartment buildings and rooming houses. President of the West Coast theater chain, Charles Skouras, bought the theater chain. Although Hansen would cling to his precious Markle, he would be forced to replace more and more of his diminishing fortune by investing in commercial buildings, even buying a used car lot. However, even these enterprises weren't enough. but about a block away from the Markle stood a new potential business venture, a nightclub. With Hansen's connections in Hollywood, a nightclub would be the perfect expansion plan. After all, what better way to help get him through the depression than open a nightclub where people could drown their sorrows in a kind of entertainment different from the movies, a more illicit kind. This new venture opened up Hansen to the seedier side of Hollywood, and would almost lead to his downfall. But at the time, Hansen wasn't worried about that, he was just trying to stay afloat. So he bought into the Florentine Gardens. The Florentine Gardens nightclub was the brainchild of architect Gordon B. Kaufman and the general manager of the Los Angeles Times, Norman Chandler. Leased to restaurant manager Guido Bracchini, the 1,000-seat club, designed in the style of a Moorish palace, opened on December 28, 1938. At first, the Florentine Gardens was labeled as family-friendly. Management encouraged parents to bring along the kids, declaring,
"There is never any boisterousness you wouldn't wish them to see."
They soon found that family-friendly didn't appeal to the hard-drinking, woman-hungry crowd with the deep pockets required to turn a profit. Manager Frank Bruni hired showman Nils Thor Granlund, also known as NTG or Granny, to bring in some adult entertainment. Along with the comedy acts and singers, came what Granlund was best known for, his girl floor shows described as cuties and near nudies, which often included the girls frolicking with men dressed in gorilla suits. During the war years, NTG invited servicemen to participate in the acts. Granlund's floor shows provided a springboard for many young women seeking fame, including Betty Hutton, Lily St. Cyr, Jean Wallace, Gwen Verdon, Marie the Body MacDonald, and Yvonne DiCarlo, who would go on to play Lily Munster on The Munsters. When Hansen moved into the position of business manager for the Florentine Gardens, he and his family also moved into a bungalow in back. Located at 6024 Carlos Avenue, was a single-story clapboard structure conveniently secluded in densely overgrown foliage. In time, and no doubt due to the temptation caused by the illicit side of nightclub management, Ida and the girls would move out, allowing Hansen to explore that temptation. He often visited his family, dining with them at the family home at 2274 Canyon Drive, then returning to the Carlos Avenue bungalow, and his new roommates. You see, with Ida and the girls gone, Hansen was free to open the Carlos Avenue bungalow to boarders. The boarders of course were young women, mostly entertainers in Granlund's floor show, but also B-girls, girls who worked the crowd, getting lonely customers to spend more by buying them drinks and dinner. It was widely believed that Beth Short worked as a B-girl at the Florentine Gardens, if not in an official capacity to the club, she was a natural B-girl for her own interests. Without a job or reliable source of income, Beth dated for her dinner. And it wasn't long before Beth caught Hansen's eye, and an obsession developed. As wild as the acts were at the club, they were nothing compared to the parties at the Carlos Avenue bungalow. NTG had a reputation for trying out the girls in his floor shows for more than just the act, and NTG had eyes for younger girls too. In 1944, NTG hired 15-year-old Jean and Dean Stoll, the Stoll sisters, and charges were filed. As Hansen delved deeper and deeper into exploring his lust due to the abundance of available and sometimes desperate girls staying at his bungalow or another of his rooming houses or apartments, he began attending sex parties in Malibu, sometimes with a new and dangerous friend. This friend, Dr. Patrick S. O'Reilly, was another fecal smear left across the Black Dahlia case. O'Reilly was a perverted sex fiend who had previously assaulted his secretary, sadistically beating her almost to death for no other reason than to satisfy his sexual desires. O'Reilly had also been investigated for being a part of a botched abortion that led to the death of 18-year-old Angelica Rose Gogic, who worked as a dancer under the pseudonym Rose and Ray. Gogic and her boyfriend, 33-year-old Alfred Mathis, sought O'Reilly's care under another assumed name, Mrs. N. Gray, and a trumped-up story that her husband was in the service. O'Reilly's examination showed Gogic to be pregnant. She stayed under his care at the hospital from October 24, 1941 to Halloween of that year. After leaving the hospital, she got an illegal abortion from James F. Petrie, a chiropractor. On November 3, Gogic returned to O'Reilly, suffering from complications, and she died on November 15. Gogic's mother believed O'Reilly referred Angelica to Petrie for the abortion. So Petrie flew the coop to Mexico under the excuse that he had to see his estranged wife, who was suffering from some sort of illness. O'Reilly also came under police scrutiny for not reporting the incident. Although he did list the cause of death as peritonitis due to septic abortion and pernicious anemia on the death certificate, he testified at the coroner's inquest that he thought the death certificate was all he needed to do rather than notifying authorities of the illegal abortion. Petrie finally returned in 1942 and surrendered himself to the LAPD. It is unknown what became of Petrie, but O'Reilly would soon be going to orgies with Mark Hansen, and would also remove his right pectoral muscle, very similar to the mutilated breast of Beth Short. Interesting enough to note that tales of sex and prostitution rings as well as illegal abortion rings come up frequently when researching the Black Dahlia case. Although O'Reilly turns up in official suspect lists in the Black Dahlia case, he is barely, if ever, mentioned in the books dealing with the crime. Officially, the police claimed there was no connection between O'Reilly and Beth. I think it is unlikely that O'Reilly would not have met Beth due to his bosom buddy, and then some, friendship with Hansen, and the amount of time Hansen knew Beth. Due to Hansen and O'Reilly's shared perversions, I find it doubtful that Hansen would not have at least mentioned the object of his obsessive desires to his friend. And I find it equally doubtful that O'Reilly wouldn't have asked to meet this alluring creature that had Hansen smitten. The only reason that I can see why Hansen wouldn't have mentioned Beth to O'Reilly would be if Hansen was afraid that his friend would try to make his own move. I also think that O'Reilly would have had a file with Driver's Sex Offense Bureau due to O'Reilly's sexualized attack on his secretary. And this file should have stood out during investigation. The only reason I can see why police wouldn't have pursued Dr. O'Reilly would be if it was confirmed that he was out of town at the time of Beth's murder. In future episodes, more will be said about an alleged abortion ring playing a part in the murder. Many of the doctors accused of being in this ring have dubious connections at best, and others could not have been a part of it due to reasons we will discuss then. However, Dr. O'Reilly had known connections to at least one abortion case. His medical background, propensity towards violence, especially sexualized violence against women, and his self-mutilation in a way shockingly similar to wounds found on Beth's body, I believe make him a compelling suspect, and one that should be looked into in greater detail, but for now, let's get back to Mark Hansen. It was about the same time that Beth Short got involved with Mark Hansen and the Florentine Gardens that her life took its final and most dangerous turn. It has never been confirmed that she met O'Reilly, but then it has never been confirmed that she ever met or knew any of the popular murder suspects portrayed in recent books, such as Leslie Dillon, in Black Dahlia, Red Rose by Pugh Eatwell, George Hodel, in the Black Dahlia Avenger series by Steve Hodel, Walter Bailey, suspect of researcher Larry Harnish, Arnold Smith, also known as Jack Anderson Wilson, in Severed by John Gilmore, or Bugsy Siegel, in the Black Dahlia Files by Donald Wolfe. Some of those are more viable than others, and some are dubious at best. But the criminal backgrounds of some of the suspects present a possibility as to what could have gotten Beth into such a dangerous predicament that led to her murder, the criminal element present at the Florentine Gardens. There was no way that a place as popular as the Florentine Gardens would not have been a major hangout for the local mafia, and would have been a logical place for visiting mobsters to be wined and dined by their West Coast peers. In my mind, there is no way that Mark Hansen could have remained clean of any mafia influence. We will look deeper into the Los Angeles Mafia in a later episode to keep the focus on Mark Hansen in this episode, but it was well known that local mobsters such as Bugsy Siegel and Mickey Cohen and their cohorts had a presence at the Florentine Gardens. Patrons in the know could easily find their way into the secret gambling operation that Siegel associate Jimmy Utley ran at the club. A former prostitute named Judy Walters described the work environment at the Florentine Gardens and the mafia influence present.
I was supposed to have been another discovery like Betty Hutton or somebody. I was promised spots in NTG's floor show at the Gardens instead of wet nursing the customers. The drinks were watered, and the food wasn't fit for a dog, and we were supposed to see that the suckers left in good spirits, and with empty pockets. Bugsy Siegel was around there once or twice. I don't know, maybe more than that, and I was looking for a way to get to Vegas, to work for Siegel, and Mo Sedway, who was living at the Roosevelt Hotel then. I knew they wanted NTG to head the Flamingo, so I stayed on, but whatever promises were made anyone at the Gardens, it didn't ever happen. Instead of getting in the chorus and being a showgirl, I ended up dancing with winos and sex fiends at Hansen's Roseland Ballroom downtown.
In brief, the mob did it theory basically says Bugsy and a few goons, including Al Greenberg, Arnold Smith aka Jack Anderson Wilson, and Maurice Clement murdered Beth, and then she was bisected by an accused abortionist by the name of Dr. Leslie Audrain. Why did they do it? Because, according to believers in this theory, Beth was pregnant by newspaper publisher Norman Chandler, who had the power and influence over both police and the mob to get Siegel and his crew to murder Beth, and for unscrupulous police to cover it up. Proponents of this theory ignore the autopsy reports that showed no evidence of pregnancy. Or they claim that the pregnancy was not revealed at the coroner's inquest so that knowledge of it could be used as a control question for weeding through suspects. Another branch of this theory is that an abortion ring played a hand in it, and that Beth may have died after a botched abortion. Another abortion ring theory ties in suspect Leslie Dillon, who some researchers, like Pew Eatwell, have tried to tie in with Mark Hansen, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On or around October 1, 1946, Beth moved into Hansen's 6024 Carlos Avenue bungalow. Dropping her off, and helping her move in, was none other than her mysterious benefactor, an often driver, who had been sometimes paying her bills and chauffeuring her around town. He either had to have been another obsessed admirer, or a paid underling of someone who had his eye on Beth, or had plans for her. This benefactor was described by Toth as
short, dark-complexioned man in his late 30s, 5 feet 6 inches tall, of medium build. A little fellow. He drove an older model black Ford sedan. Beth called him Maurice, and he promised to set up Elizabeth in an apartment in Beverly Hills.
This black sedan that keeps showing up, is it the same 1936 or 1937 Ford sedan reported by witnesses on the morning of January 15, only hours before Beth's body was discovered? After getting dropped off at the Hansen residence, Beth started her short, but tumultuous stay. She shared a room with bit player and Toth, sometimes described as one of Hansen's girlfriends, but the more research I do, I'm coming to the conclusion that they were not romantically involved, or if they were in a very open relationship. And Toth seemed like one of the better people Beth met during this last turbulent part of her life. Toth said this about Beth and her time at the Hansen residence.
We used to think the world of that kid. She was always well-behaved and sweet when I knew her. But Beth couldn't stand up to trouble, and she was always in hot water. She was skeptical of people, but despite that, often stumbled into trash.
Toth also noticed the almost immediate attraction Hansen showed for Beth.
Mark really liked Beth, he had a yen for her.
Toth also stated Mark tried to make her a couple times. But Beth thwarted his advances by using one of her usual tactics to fend off amorous suitors. She claimed she was a virgin. Perhaps that only made Hansen want her more. I'd say having a yen for Beth was an understatement. He became obsessed with her. Hansen approached one of his renters, a one Mrs. Artis, who was a Hollywood seamstress, to make 2 dresses for Beth and to see the most beautiful creature in Hollywood. And remember, this was just toward the start of a 10-day stay at Hansen's. Artis fitted Beth for the dresses and made them, but she never delivered them. However, it wasn't long before Hansen's newfound muse started getting on his nerves, and Beth's unending stream of dates turned Hansen's yen to full-blown jealousy. Toth described.
Beth had to be cautious. Everybody picked her up a block away, and everybody dropped her off a block away, because she wouldn't dare bring anybody to the house.
Detective Finus Brown asked Toth why.
Well, Mark wouldn't like it. I mean, he more or less possessed her from the time she came there, so naturally, she didn't even have anyone call for her there at the house ever. If it hadn't been for Mark, I guess I would have found out lots of things, because they would have called there. You know what I mean? I would have got acquainted with them, but he warned her not to bring anybody down there, not to go out with anybody else.
One time Mark noticed that Beth had made a long-distance call to Joseph Gordon Fickling, which enraged him. Perhaps the best way to describe Beth's time at Mark Hansen's house is for Hansen to describe her stay in his own words. Bear in mind that his statements gloss over his obsessive attraction for Beth and his jealous streak. The following is from Mark Hansen's testimony to the 1949 grand jury as he related to investigator Frank Jemison.
State your full name.
Mark Hansen.
Were you acquainted with Beth Short before her death?
Yes, I knew her.
Just how did you happen to meet her?
Well, her and another girl had no place to stay, and a fellow brought them over.
Was that Marjorie Graham with Beth Short at that time?
Yes. Yes.
And can you remember the month and the year when this happened?
I think it was in October, in 1946.
Was she a pretty good-looking gal?
Well, I thought she was fair-looking, average. If it wasn't for her teeth. She had bad teeth. Other than that, she would have been beautiful.
About how long did these two girls live there at that time in October?
Perhaps a week or 10 days, something like that.
Did they leave at that time then?
Well, I asked them to move because this Graham girl, she was inclined to be liquored up, and I didn't like it at all, and this Short girl, she had always some undesirable-looking character waiting for her outside and bringing her home.
Did she have some boyfriends the time she was there?
There was one particular fellow that brought her home and came and got her. He didn't look very good. He had a coupe of some kind, I think it was a 38 or 39 Chevrolet or Ford, something like that.
He didn't look so good to you?
No. I saw him from the outside. I saw him standing, coming to the door, picking her up.
What did you tell Beth Short about this fellow that didn't look so good?
I didn't tell her anything. I told her I wanted them to move. Didn't want them. Those damn girls, liquored up. I asked them to move.
You didn't have any bad feelings against Beth Short at this time, did you?
No. I didn't have any hard feelings against her at all.
With all your experience, didn't you kinda take an interest in her welfare and, you know, about these fellows she was going out with?
I spoke to her about did she know the caliber of men they were. She said yes, she had been around, she knew what life was all about. That is what she said.
Would you say she was a sexy type girl?
Well, I don't know if she was a sexy type girl. She appeared to be a very nice girl.
Well, as far as your knowledge of her is concerned, would you say she was having intercourse with these various fellows, or more of the prostitute type or not?
No. She appeared to be a more domestic type girl.
Did she tell you that she was engaged to Gordon Fickling while she was there?
Yes. She was engaged to some fellow, Flyer or something. I think it was Gordon Fickling. He was in the East. She said she was engaged to be married.
Did she indicate to you she was saving herself for him?
Yes, more or less.
Well, then you say these two girls left your place about that time? Where did they move to, do you remember?
No, I don't. I think it was over to that apartment hotel.
After leaving Hansen's home, Marjorie and Beth shacked up with Bill Robinson and Marvin Margolis at the Guardian Arms. Beth slept on the sofa, while apparently, Graham shared the bed with both men. But things were still bad between Beth and Hansen. So much so that Toth picked up Beth's mail, which she was still having delivered to Hansen's house. So that Beth wouldn't have to deal with Mark. It wasn't long before Marjorie decided to head back to Massachusetts. For whatever reason, Margolis brought both girls back to Hansen's house under the story that he was Beth's cousin to keep Mark's jealousy from flaring up. Hansen's statement to the grand jury investigation continues.
Well, isn't it a fact that she moved back over to the house there for a period of time prior to her going over to the Chancellor?
Yes. Here's what happened. She came back and visited, and Margolis was doing all the talking, and he says she was going to move back home, and he carried the suitcase up, and I says, "What's this?" He says, "Can she leave this here overnight? She's going away tomorrow, and would like to leave these until tomorrow."
Who's doing the talking?
This cousin.
Margolis?
Yes, and I said, "I guess that will be all right." That night I come home, Beth Short was there.
Inside the house?
I said, "I thought you were just going to leave your suitcases," and she said, "I didn't have no place to stay. Would I mind if she stayed?" She just kept staying and staying. Then she moved over to the Chancellor apartment.
Now on this second occasion and Beth Short left to go over to the Chancellor apartments.
Yes.
How did she happen to be leaving your place on that occasion?
Because I told her I didn't want her to be staying there. She said she would find a place, and she did.
What was your reason for asking Beth Short to leave?
I didn't want her there. I didn't like the caliber of people she showed up with.
Isn't it a fact that you felt sorry for her, and she was a pretty nice girl?
Yes. I told her to her face. She still went out and kicked around.
You didn't like the idea of her kicking around?
That's right. I didn't want that false business. Cussing, drinking. I had no reason for having her there.
While she was living at the Chancellor apartments, she came back to your house and got mail?
I didn't see her, but she was sitting there one night when I came home, with and about 5:30, 6 o'clock, sitting and crying, and saying she had to get out of there. She was crying about being scared. One thing and another, I don't know. She said she was going to Oakland to a sister. She said she was scared.
Did she have dinner with you that night?
Yes, she did. She had dinner with Anne.
Did you sympathize with her when she was crying?
Yes, I did. I felt sorry for her.
Did you take her home, up to the Chancellor apartments?
Yes.
What did you talk about?
She was talking about she was going to Oakland to visit her sister there, and asked if she could come back to my house when she got back. I told her, I don't think so. Better find another place.
What did you tell her? It was on account of these boys?
No. It was her whole makeup, because she picked up with bums. Not only them, but with bums.
When you took her over to the Chancellor, did she ask you for money that night?
No.
What was she doing for money?
I don't know.
When you took her over there that night, did you take her up to her room?
No. I left her off on the street.
You believed she was going to Oakland?
The next day, she says she was going the next day.
She did leave the next day.
I don't know.
But you didn't see her again?
I never saw her again.
I am told by certain people who have known you that you have from time to time mentioned that you had some knowledge of the medical profession.
No, I never have.
Do you recall telling some people that?
No, sir, I never have. I never had any knowledge of any medical profession whatsoever.
Well now, will you try to remember? Do you remember telling people you did have a connection with, for instance, abortions?
Abortions? No. I never have. I never say no such thing. I never had any knowledge of such.
Did you ever assist in connection with an abortion operation of some girl?
No, never. I don't know anything about it.
And then you never did attempt any abortion with instruments, surgical instruments?
Oh, no. I don't know nothing about such.
Okay. That is all I want, your answer.
But Beth wasn't entirely innocent in her dealings with Hansen, and the next incident is also the last straw. When Hansen brought home a new girl, Beth's own jealous streak showed. And Toth said Beth called the girl a tramp. And said
She had a lot of high ideas, that Betty, believe me, with her Boston family, and all that stuff. She got up and locked her suitcase, because she thought this girl was going to get into her suitcase, and the other girl said, I don't want to touch your damn suitcase. I don't want anything in there. Anyway, words were flying back and forth, and there was a beef and a fistfight, and Mark stepped in between them.
After Hansen sent Beth packing for the last time, she went to San Diego, and you would think we would be done with Hansen's story. But an address book discovered in a parcel of Beth's belongings mailed to the Los Angeles Examiner led to him being involved in the investigation for years to come. Although the addresses listed within were related to Beth, the address book itself was not hers. The name embossed in gold lettering on the cover was Mark Hansen. His story was that Beth must have stolen it. And interestingly, several pages had been conveniently removed. Hansen's name would also turn up in a controversial part of the case called the missing week, as we have seen in a previous episode. And if the following testimony is true, it would contradict statements made to the grand jury that he had never seen her again after he dropped Beth off at the Chancellor. Taken from an interview with Connie Starr by Lieutenant Frank Jemison on January 26, 1950. And Toth invited Connie Starr to dinner on Saturday, January 11, 1947. They dined with Mark Hansen at his 6024 Carlos Avenue residence. At around 9 p.m., Starr said, Beth and her boyfriend, a young kid with brown hair arrived. 2 days later, on January 28, 1950, Lieutenant Jemison and Detective Finus Brown followed up on Connie Starr's statement by interviewing N. Toth, who corroborated Starr's account. Lieutenant Jemison questioned Toth.
Do you recall a time when at Mark Hansen's house, there, when Betty came in after you had dinner, with some young fellow, you had company there, and she was dressed in a pink dress and she was cold, it was rather cool and chilly, and Mark got a blanket to put around her and heavy socks to put on?
I do remember that.
And Toth did not know the name of Beth's date. However, she did confirm the details of Mark Hansen's interactions with Beth at the time.
Mark got a blanket to put around her and heavy socks for her to put on.
So, as we have seen, Mark Hansen, along with N. Toth, would be involved with the investigation well through the 1949 grand jury investigation, as we have already looked at. In 1948, Mark faced setbacks after a fire heavily damaged his beloved Markle Theater, resulting in $100,000 in damages, and lawsuits for unlawful eviction from the theater managers after Hansen fired them. And the Florentine Gardens faced bankruptcy and growing debts approached $100,000. Billboard magazine seemed to drive the final nail into the Gardens' coffin, declaring the club defunct in October 1948. And in 1949 the Florentine Gardens would be rebranded as the Cotton Club, featuring an all-Negro review headlining Count Basie and his orchestra. At least until the new club owners flew the coop after only 10 weeks. Mark Hansen and 2 other co-owners reopened the Florentine Gardens later that year, but the writing was on the wall, and the club would be but a shadow of its former glory. 1949 would be an eventful year for Mark Hansen in more ways than just in his business interests. As well as being grilled by the grand jury, he would get his own taste of someone's raging jealousy. Lola Titus, a large, heavily made-up taxi dancer, tried out for more than just the floor show at the Florentine Gardens. She found herself added to the growing list of Hansen's lovers. Only Titus wasn't satisfied with just being another lover. In her own words, Titus said,
I made up my mind that he was either going to love me, marry me, or take care of me, or I was going to kill him.
Leaving Titus in the bedroom after a fling, Hansen went into the bathroom for a shave. Lola snuck up behind him and shot him in the back with a .25 automatic. After Titus fled, Hansen managed to call an ambulance. The critically wounded Hansen was rushed to the hospital with a collapsed lung. A bullet had missed his heart by only 7/10 of an inch. Even before he received treatment for his wounds, Hansen cried,
"Get me Brown. Get me Finest Brown. I've got to speak to Brown."
Finest Brown? Yes, the same Finest Brown involved in the Black Dahlia investigation since day one. Why? Dahlia conspiracy theorists claim Finest was on the take, getting paid off by the mob, as well as Hansen, to keep the cops from nosing around the Florentine Gardens. And other theorists figure Finest knew about Hansen's alleged involvement in the Dahlia murder, and that Hansen's knowledge and connections to both the mafia and abortion rings and payoffs to cops made Hansen a special case. Others say he was a bagman for Hansen. Officially, Finest Brown had been part of an undercover operation at the Florentine Gardens. Grand jury foreman Harry Lawson questioned Brown about the incident for the grand jury investigation.
What was your involvement in the Lola Titus shooting?
Lola Titus, a short time before this shooting, I think around March or April of this year, was called to my attention by informants. I was told that she was involved in lewd pictures, lewd photography as a model, and also possibly connected up with some narcotics. I secured a picture of her in the nude, and checked our records, and found that she had been a dancehall girl.
The point of my questioning was, when you learned Lola Titus was the one that shot Hansen, why weren't you surprised you got a call?
I wasn't surprised because as far as I knew, I was the only one who knew who Lola Titus was.
You had discussed Lola Titus with him?
I had, yes. He had given me some information on her.
Were you one of the officers that had frequented his nightclub, ostensibly cooperating with him with respect to bad characters, persons of ill repute, that he knew?
That's right.
And that took place in what period of time?
1947, first of 48, through 48 to the present time.
Did you know when Hansen was taken to the hospital that he said, "Get Brown for me. Get in touch with Brown"?
That is what I understand.
How did you get that information, sir?
Well, that was through, when I came in the next day, the newspaper reporters told me that.
I see. Did you talk to Mark Hansen about the matter then?
I did that night, around 8 o'clock, 7:30 or 8 o'clock. When I went to his room in the hospital and talked to him. He told me that, it was Lola Titus who did it.
Well, I have always been curious to know why Mark Hansen wanted to see you, and was shot on account of this Titus thing.
It's doubtful anyone will ever know the truth of it all. But when Hansen called for Brown, Brown was out of town until later, as he said in his testimony. Initially, his brother Thad showed up in his place. Thad Brown, who would miss out on being appointed chief of police in 1950 by one vote, losing to the famous William Parker, but would replace Parker after Parker's death as interim chief of the LAPD in 1966. But Finest Brown, by testimony before the grand jury, stated, and pretty much admitted he was undercover. He said, yes. He had given me some information on her. He admitted he had gotten information on Lola Titus. Lola Titus was arrested, tried, and convicted. Sent to the Patton Hospital for the Insane, she would spend the last decade of her life there, dying at only 30 years old. One last thing to note about the Titus incident is that Lola claimed that she knew Beth and that Mark Hansen had killed her. There will be more to say about potential police conspiracies and abortion rings in a future episode. But to wrap up the Mark Hansen episode, we need to look into speculation that Hansen was directly involved with another suspect, Leslie Dillon. While we will look into Dillon in much greater detail in his own episode, let's briefly look into speculation raised by Piu Eatwell, in her book Black Dahlia, Red Rose, that Hansen and Dillon were both involved in Beth's murder at the Astor Motel, and that Hansen was identified as a mysterious figure known as the man from Batavia. Dillon, a reported pimp, supposedly worked for the prostitution ring centered around the Florentine Gardens, and sometimes worked as an errand boy for Mark Hansen. One day, in a fit of jealousy, Hansen said, "Get rid of her," referring to Beth after she and Hansen got into an argument. Dillon, a psychotic maniac, took Hansen's words literally as an order. He kept her for a time at the Astor Motel. And then killed her. The owners and managers of the Astor Motel claimed to have seen Hansen there and identified him as a figure called the man from Batavia. And they also claimed a woman matching Beth's description had been seen at the motel. And finally, they found a blood-stained mattress and floor covered in blood and feces in one of the rooms. Hansen used his connections with the Brown brothers to cover things up. Why? Because Finus was more than on the take, he actually worked as a bagman for Mark Hansen. And that with Thad's political ambitions already in play, he was only too happy to help cover up the murder. Or maybe, as already speculated, Finus Brown was just affiliated with the Florentine Gardens as part of an undercover operation. I doubt any of us will know the truth of it. The grand jury testimony seems to corroborate Finus Brown's statement, especially with the statement, "I had, yes. He had given me some information on her." That Mark Hansen may have been an informant for the police. So, was Mark Hansen playing both sides? Filling his pockets from mafia interests and working with the cops as an informant? Who knows? If Mark Hansen had given Finus Brown information about Lola Titus, for whatever reason, it would make sense that he would have called Finus Brown after she shot him, especially if Finus Brown was working undercover at the Florentine Gardens, thus, no police conspiracy, just an informant contacting his police connection about what happened with a suspect. This is all too long and too convoluted to go into here. Let's save this for the Dillon episode. Just what or how much Mark Hansen knew or participated in is up for speculation, although it is known that he knew Dr. O'Reilly and attended sex parties with him. But he seems to be the puzzle piece used to connect diverse suspects and conspiracy theories. Yes, Hansen was a suspect. Did he do it? No. I doubt it. Did people affiliated with him do it? Possibly. Regardless, Hansen was not guilt-free. He used young, celebrity hopeful women for sex, as did NTG, who had an apartment above Hansen's garage that he used to sate his own deviant sexual tastes. Hansen and Dr. O'Reilly attended sex orgy parties together. In the end, Mark Hansen may not be guilty of murder, but he is not innocent. Young women were but playthings for him and his buddies. He profited from the mob, and may have been an informant to the police. Beth Short moved into Mark Hansen's life and walked of her own free will into the Florentine Gardens. Doing so may have led her one step closer to death. It did seem that the same time she met Hansen was also the same time that her life took a turn towards death. In the end, sadly, I doubt we will ever know the truth.